Welcome to editorial and pre-visualization of visual effects. This is one of my favorite subjects. I've been editing a number of visual effects type content for several years, and I've always enjoyed the pre-visualization stage of editorial almost as much as the actual final editorial stage. I'll be defining these different stages in just a moment, but before I get started, I want to make clear that the materials we're going to be using here are actually created by several editors, not just myself. We'll be working with the Keep Clear short film, which was directed by Corey Rosen and edited by myself. We'll also be looking at the Honda robot spot. This was edited by Alan Comenti of Western Images in San Francisco. Alan has got one of the coolest hairdos you'll ever see. If you get a chance to meet him, check it out. The creative on this spot was done by Ruben Poster, the ad agency out of Los Angeles, California. I want to give special thanks to them for contributing this commercial to the series. We'll also be taking a look at the Chevy Monte Carlo 2 Live spot, which was edited by Dennis Kutzen of Cuts in Detroit. Dennis is one of the savviest pre-visualization editors I've ever seen. You'll really be amazed at how well this spot is planned from very beginning all the way through the final edit. The creative for this spot was done by Campbell Ewald of Detroit, Michigan. So using these three spots from different editors, we're going to take a look at how the actual storytelling devices were foreseen from the very beginning, starting with storyboards, evolving then into an actual production shoot, and then finishing up with the actual creative editorial of the finished shoot elements, the film elements, and the slow introduction of the actual effect shots into that editorial process, culminating in the final piece. This is a fascinating process, and we've got some great materials to traverse this process with. So let's go ahead and jump right in and get started. I really like editing. And editing is all about images. And to cover this material, I want to really focus on images. So we're going to spend a lot of time actually looking at the editorial process, looking at the images that were used, and evaluating the different things that were going through the editor's mind in different stages of the editorial process. So let's jump right into actually talking about the editing of these three spots. FX editorial is really very different than editing editorial, where we're really focused on the end-to-end of how several shots together add up to tell a story. Well, some of that is going to be taking place in our discussion of pre-visualization. Really what I want to focus in on is the effects editorial, which has more to do with how individual shots themselves are edited together and how they come together with the shots around it before and after an individual effect shot. So I'm not going to try to cover the awesome task of covering editorial as a philosophy and as a medium, as an art form of telling stories. That really is something best reserved for a much lengthier discussion. We're going to focus in on effects editing, a very specific type of editing. Let's get right to it. The first rule in any communication is having a thesis statement. What are we trying to say? That's particularly true in any kind of storytelling, and really there's a micro level which takes place on a shot-by-shot level. Each shot in a program should be telling a story. And in particular, an effect shot should be telling a story. If you're taking the time and expense to do a visual effect shot for a program, you've got to have some story that you're trying to tell in that shot. Otherwise, you're just wasting money. So the first thing we want to think about in any effect shot is, what is the story? How is the story progressed by the individual shot? And on a micro level, what is the story of that shot? What are we trying to convey? Storyboarding stage, where an actual program is laid out, shot by shot, from beginning to end, each shot has a graphic story that's conveyed by the artist who draws up the storyboard. So within that shot, we should already be thinking about how is the effect going to add to the story of this shot, and why is an effect needed in the first place? During the storyboarding process, we're already thinking about the syntax of the story. We start to think about how we might use camera moves to enhance a story or show emphasis within an action of a shot. We start to think about graphic representation of expression and motion. A good storyboard artist can really bring out a lot of character just in these drawings very early on, before we've even done casting in some cases. The overall structure in terms of the camera angles that are going to be used, the coverage in terms of how many different setups are going to be needed, how many shots are going to be needed to get the right editorial angles so that we can convey the story when we're doing the editing afterwards. We even start to think about placement of camera. Is there going to be a room for the tripod and the camera crane in some cases, if we're doing a shot that involves moving objects, or if we're in an enclosed space like something surrounded by walls, are we going to be able to get the camera to the right vantage point to capture the action that we want? So let's talk about editing of the effect shot itself. Some people call this intra-frame editing. So it's not editing multiple shots together, but rather taking the shot and editing within that shot. So what are some of the concerns in intraframe editing? What are we thinking about storytelling-wise? Well, most importantly, where is your eye drawn in the shot? What is it that your eye is going to be looking at as this shot transpires? And this can be affected by the framing, the animation itself within the shot in terms of 2D or 3D animation that's introduced. We want to make sure that the viewer isn't distracted by things that aren't relevant to what you're actually trying to convey, and we'll actually do little subtle tricks to actually focus your energies on what the viewer is supposed to be looking at. With all shots, there's two kinds of motion that we want to pay attention to that actually convey a lot of hidden meaning, but are very kind of subconsciously perceived by the viewer. And those are two kinds of motions. That's the motion of the camera, which is often not even perceived to be moving, but very often is moving, and also the motion of the elements within the shot. Let's address the idea of motion of the characters or the elements within a scene first. Consider that an actor, for example, on location is performing at a certain pace, and that pace really tells a lot about the action that we want to feel. Well, visual effects elements will do the same. We have to make them act, we have to make them perform for us at a pace that's going to convey the story. Let's take a look at some of the characters in Keep Clear, and you'll notice that we have our friend the ducks that are kind of tentative, that are just the introduction to the concept that there's something going on in front of this car here in this Keep Clear section. So the ducks come out very tentatively, eking along. There's not really any humor in it yet. It's just kind of bizarre that these ducks are there. Then we have this mime. It's kind of like this introspective, ooh, I am a mime kind of guy walking across, and it's a little bit more aggressive than the ducks, but it's just really starting to evolve. The motion is just starting to happen, with ease across the screen. There's still some tentativeness. Next, we have these ninjas that are like very kinetic, that are bouncing around in the scene, move from very quickly across. There's a lot of them. There's a multitude of them. That actually creates a lot more energy for this shot. Finally, we end up with this marching band, which is all over the place. They're wildly moving their arms about. They're much more aggressively going forward. And really, it kind of, these actions progress from very subtle ducks to very aggressive marching band. And you can see that timing, that movement within these characters is really helping to convey the story. Well, likewise, when we have an effects element that isn't filmed on location, but something that we introduce or we create, we want to give it that kind of action. We want to create that performance. And that's usually done by the editor as part of the editorial process. We bring these elements to life by creating timings within the shot. Another aspect of character or element motion within the shot has to do with the direction of motion, not just the rate or speed or how it's progressing, but what direction it's going in. There's some psychological tendencies. Things that move left to right usually have kind of uplifting, positive, connotations, whereas objects that go right to left or up to down have kind of more depressing, more sinister connotations. So you'll notice that most advertising commercials really have a kind of meandering motion that's left to right. There's a lot of natural tendency in that direction. This isn't necessarily conscious. It's just a very kind of natural thing that is perceived by viewers. It might have something to do with Western civilization's character sets, which mostly read from left to right, perhaps, or maybe there's just something about right-handedness, which really predisposes us to like things that are moving towards the right, where we can control them in our right hand. Who knows? So when we're looking at the direction of an element, we want to think about how does that direction match up with the movement in the other shots, the shot before and after the effect shot. We also want to think about how that energy of direction communicates whatever it is that we're trying to tell in the story. So a direction that's kind of fleeting and like towards the upper part of the screen is going to have different sentiments than things that are going down and as I said, to the left, kind of like more obscure directions of motion. Now, this may sound like just psychological mumbo-jumbo, but really, if you think about it, this is very strongly conveyed when objects are moving in these different directions. One more aspect of timing within an element or a character has to do with how time is compressed and expanded. Editing really gives you the ability to play with time in a way that most art forms don't allow you to. We can really expand and collapse time through some editorial tricks. And we're going to take a look at a couple of examples in Keep Clear where we actually don't give enough time for certain actions to transpire. For example, here in BM4, in the UFO shot, we can see that as we leave the shot behind, there's still some characters being sucked up into the UFO, and really it would take a couple more seconds before the UFO could maybe shut its hatch door and disappear. But what we do is we compress time so that as soon as we leave the shot, the UFO is essentially gone because the character now has his glasses back on, he's looking around the scene, and presumably now with his glasses on, he would have seen this UFO. Well, as you're editing, you might say, well, we need to leave more time to make this happen. But of course, that can be really monotonous to watch. Things that take place in real time in an editorial sense are really just too monotonous. As a story, we can perceive things much more rapidly, and that's where the editor has to play with compression of time, in many cases, for accelerating the movement, especially in a comedy sense like here. We really want to keep the thing going, keep it very fresh and tight so that it's still interesting to watch after 2 minutes. We can also expand time to get the opposite effect. Instead of trying to accelerate and keep things going at a higher energy, we can actually try to slow things down, either for comic purpose or for dramatic purpose. Let's take a look at another shot in Keep Clear, where we actually have the car kind of arrived at its scene, and we have this wide shot here showing us what's going on. There's this country road, and in the middle of nowhere, this car is stopped at this Keep Clear sign. There's really no apparent reason why the car should be stopped here. Initially in the cut, we had this kind of a little bit shorter, probably only 3 seconds long. It was just establishing that, oh, the car's here and what happens next. But after looking at it a couple of times, the director decided that he wanted to expand this scene. We actually tripled the length, and it's almost 7 or 8 seconds now, really to kind of give it a kind of a reverse comedic sense. It's like we're here, we're looking, and we're like, okay, I get that there's nothing going on. Why are we still looking at the shot? Okay, and finally we're out of here. So during that time, what's being told through that expansion of time is, okay, I really want you to pay attention. There's something odd, very odd about this particular shot. So all three of these concepts, the concept of movement of a character and how that conveys emotion, the concept of direction of movement and how that can subtly play on our feelings of what's going on in a shot, and very importantly, the concept of compression and expansion of time and how that plays on our perception of a story. These are all movement aspects of a shot, within a shot. Okay, what about the motion of the camera? Now, the reason that this is so important in visual effects is that many times visual effects take place with a fake camera. That is, we shoot things locked off, there's no movement of camera because that really greatly simplifies the visual effects. Or we have a completely synthetic camera in a 3D shot where there is no camera, we're just creating graphics and 3D animation. In these instances, we often forget that, oh, there's a camera, let's move it in a way that a cameraman would or that a director would on location during a shoot, where the camera is more often than not having some kind of thought put into it about where it should be going, how it should be panning or tilting or zooming, or whether or not we should have it handheld to create some kind of vibration or excitement, how it might follow action. For example, if we have someone running or if we have someone jumping, there's sometimes a little bit of camera innuendo that kind of accentuates that movement. Well, all that comes very naturally when you shoot something on location with actual practical elements. But when you're doing something as an effect, you sometimes eliminate motion to simplify things and later introduce motion to retell how that motion might have actually added to the story. By the way, the mumbo-jumbo word practically refers to something that's actually shot on location as opposed to something that's done as an effect after the fact. So when you're talking about setting up your production and planning each shot, practical shots are shots that you can actually shoot as opposed to effect shots which will not be shot, but rather elements will be shot and the actual effect shot will be completed after the fact in post. Let's break down the different kinds of camera movements that are often seen in real photography. These would be the pan movement, the tilt movement, changes in focal length, also known as zooming, and then we have kind of handheld and Steadicam held or harness held camera shots, which can have a different effect altogether. Here you can see that a pan involves actually taking the camera on its axis and moving it from side to side, creating a kind of head turn effect. A tilt, we have someone nodding their head up and down, the camera looking up and down. And you can actually combine a pan and a tilt to get more complex, more sweeping motion. Then you have the zoom, where we actually seem to get closer or farther away from a scene based on changing the focal length of the lens. And again, you can combine this with a pan and tilt to get sweeping panoramic shots that are very dynamic, have lots of motion in them, not only of the orientation of the camera, but also the perception of what's being focused on by the camera. So as we pan, tilt, and zoom away or into a scene, it really draws us towards the action or away from the action to kind of look at things more broadly. Here's some examples of some camera motion inside of some of the spots we've been looking at, and you can see that the camera motion adds to the excitement of the scene. For example, here with the robot, we can see that as the robot is rushing towards this car because he's so excited to see the car, you can see that the camera is quickly dollying with it, following along as if on a track to capture the motion as this robot is escaping from us, escaping off to the right very excitedly. In this robot shot, this motion of camera actually exists. The elements were filmed with the camera moving, and then the introduction of the robot into the scene as an effect was done to match that camera motion. So we're actually marrying the camera motion to the actual effects. However, in some cases, we're going to completely reinvent the camera to give it that kind of motion when there really wasn't any to begin with. Here in this shot in Keep Clear, we have the shot of the UFO arriving and settling down over the car. Now, if you were standing behind this car with a camera and you saw a UFO arriving, you would most likely lift the camera up a little bit and go, whoa, what's this above me going on up here? And if this had been filmed on location with a real plane or UFO arriving, the cameraman would have naturally done that. It's just an instinctive thing to do. Since we locked the camera off for this shot because we wanted to make it easy to marry these elements together to introduce this UFO, there is no motion. So as a post-process, as a visual effect, we're actually going to take the plate and just simulate a slight tilt up. It's very subtle, and you normally would not even notice that this was going on. However, if you're breaking down the visual effect shot editorially, these are the things that really make an effect shot. This really adds to the emotion of the shot. That's why paying attention to the lack of a camera in a visual effect shot will make your effect shots better by reminding you to sometimes introduce that camera movement back in to make them seem more real. When you're trying to break down the motion of the camera and what maybe the motion of the camera should be in an effect shot, think about some of the classic film devices for camera motion. One of the ones that I love the most is, I think Hitchcock invented this, is the character backing up into the edge of frame. The frame is set up in such a way that our character is precariously balanced against the edge of the screen, and we can't quite see what's off screen, and yet we're moving in that direction. It's a very scary feeling to be moving somewhere where we can't see. Your intuition is, let's look to the right a little bit more. I want to see what's over there behind the character. Of course, a lot of horror films have overused this effect to actually try to give us those cheap thrills, that little scare of like, oh, there's something there. It's a very overused device, but when seen in Hitchcock films, it's masterfully used to really create suspense. You can actually feel the blood rising in your brain as you see this character kind of precariously moving to the edge of frame. We can create a contrary effect, which is to excite the viewer about what's coming up next, much like you would on a roller coaster. If you ever notice, when you sit on a roller coaster, you're constantly looking ahead, not to where you're going on the track at that very moment, but what's going to be around the next bend of the track. So as we run around the corner here and I hold the camera, we can actually intensify the excitement of the shot by looking ahead just a bit, actually starting to turn the camera a little bit before we actually turn ourselves. So we can actually get one step ahead of ourselves, ahead of the effect elements, to actually accentuate the excitement of the scene. Yet another kind of timing is what I call end-to-end timings. And again, end-to-end refers to, well, we've got this one shot coming in, then we cut to our effect shot, and then we cut to the next shot, whether that be an effect shot or just a normal shot. How these shots come together in terms of how the action of a character or an action of a scene or the momentum of a scene, how that conveys between one shot and the next is really critical. Let's take a look at some examples of this. Here in Keep Clear, we have a shot where we start to see a practical effect, which was there was some light that was being obscured by some kind of panel on location. And as that panel is put in front of the light, we get this shadow creeping across the character's face. So this kind of foretells of something happening in the next scene. So the timing of how this action cuts together with the arrival of the UFO is really critical, because we're literally jumping between, oh, something is going on, and oh, that's what's going on. So those two shots really belong together, and as a result, it's really critical to marry this practical effect, which was filmed on location, with this visual effect, which needs to kind of sell the practical effect. Really, the effect of the UFO arriving is pretty convincing within itself in terms of its timing, whereas if we were to go back and just look at the raw footage of that shadow coming across the face, if we let it go just a couple more frames or even a second, you start to realize that it's a very cheesy effect, and you can tell that it's just a simple piece of cardboard. There isn't really this mammoth shadow arriving over the shot. Now, when we originally shot this, we were afraid that because we hadn't achieved the practical effect, we were going to have to turn this into an effect shot, which would have been quite complicated to create a cast of a real shadow across the entire frame. We would have had to darken highlight areas and differently than the rest of the plate, so that the whole plate would seem like it was enveloped in a shadow. Luckily, we were able to save that in editorial by cutting it creatively so that the action sold itself from end to end. Let's take a look at one more example of this end-to-end timing. In this shot, we have the UFO actually settling into its position over the car. And in the next shot, we have the UFO actually already in progress sucking up these characters. Now, if you really were to go in and look at these two shots, you can see that we've really compressed time. This UFO is this big object. It's coming down to a very low height, very low altitude right above the car. Yet when we cut to the low angle here, we see these characters as if there was hundreds of yards above them being sucked up into the UFO. So we've compressed not only time, but also space. We've vertically reduced the distance to make a more dramatic shot out of the UFO. This is fine to do, but it's important to pay attention when you're doing it so you know you're doing it, so that you don't actually give away anything that you don't want to. So here in the Chevy spot, we can really take a look at all three of these concepts coming together masterfully. First of all, we've got the motion of the character of the car within each of the shots. Then we've got the motion of the camera throughout the shots. And finally, we have the lining up of these different kinds of motion and these different kinds of storytelling energies between the three shots. We have the intro shot where the car is in the Arizona desert, transitioning into the second shot on the racetrack, and then ending at the finale back in the desert in a very seamless fashion as if it was one continuous shot. Unbeknownst to most visual effects artists, it's actually the editor that gets to control the graphic composition of most effect shots. You see, the editor has all the elements at the disposition of the system. We actually get to bring them in, play with multiple timings, move them about graphically, actually play with different iterations or takes of different actions. This is really where we get to balance out the composition, much like a painter who would get to put a little color over here, a little color over there. All of that is decided during the editing. Later on, we'll have a visual effects artist execute the shot for us, but the editor actually is the master of the domain of the graphic composition. And that's why effects editing really starts and ends with compositing, actually laying out the graphic composition of a shot. As an example, let's look at this shot of the UFO abduction. Here we've got 15 different elements that were photographed, but it's up to me as the editor to graphically combine these to tell the story. This is the most fun of any aspect of visual effects work, actually getting to decide how the story is told. Now, obviously, the director is going to have some say in this, but as the editor, you get to actually pre-visualize how these elements are going to come together in this shot. You can see here, from the very beginning, we're trying one kind of motion, then we're evolving into a different approach with a different balance, with different positioning of the characters, and then here you can see how we finally ended up with the final action. But really, all of this started with the editorial process. This didn't happen with the sorry bloke who had to receive all these elements, do all the hard work of cutting mats and pulling blue screen extractions, and actually doing the rendering to combine these elements in the final take. So as you can see, the decision of how these elements come together is a very big editorial decision. It's actually what drives the entire effect shot in the later stages of execution. Another example of how editorial compositing takes place, let's look at some of the reframing issues. Here we have a couple of plates, and you can see that they were filmed with a lot more exposure area than what we really needed. This is going to be a 185 masked film. So we actually have the flexibility in post, if we needed, to move the frame up or down to reveal different parts of the scene. Well, on this shot, I didn't like the particular framing where we had a little too much sky and not enough centralized attention on the action, which is really the keep clear sign. So by actually moving the shot up slightly, which is an editorial decision, we've actually changed the storytelling aspect of this shot and added to our effects budget because we now have to turn this shot into an effect shot. Okay, so much for the compositing editorial aspect. Let's look at the lineup editorial aspect. Lineup is taking actions from different plates being photographed elements, and then lining them up editorially so that they work together. So this is the syncopation of a background element, a foreground element, an explosion element. All these things can slip back and forth in time, but until the editor lines them up, you don't really have the effect shot. This decision is later transferred to the effects artist as a kind of sheet of action, an edit decision list that they can then use to assemble the shot based on those decisions. As an example, let's look at the duck shot and keep clear. Well, to get these ducks to behave correctly on the set, a duck wrangler actually went out and used food to draw the attention of the duck. We put crumbs on the ground. There was actually several PAs running around like crazy trying to control the ducks and herd them back into the location so that they would move from left to right with some kind of action, the tentative action that we wanted them to feel as they walked across the scene. So we've got about 8 minutes of ducks walking across this blue screen. So The editorial lineup involves looking through these actions and picking a moment in time that we can grab and introduce into the scene in front of the car and get the final effect shot. So as you can see, the lineup involves actually choosing the action that's going to work for the effect shot. This is almost always the case with an effect shot. You usually have 10, 15, 20 times more footage than what you really need for a shot, and the real art comes in picking the right piece of action for that shot. In the case of the abduction shot, I want to talk about another kind of lineup consideration, which is efficiency. With all these characters being actually sucked up into the UFO, these elements were photographed against a blue screen, but the blue screen wasn't big enough for the characters. Now, this seems silly, of course, but when we got out there on location and the director was rolling, well, the characters wanted to have more dynamic motion than what could be constrained to within this small blue screen. So certain characters were waving their arms about, or their musical instruments were going off the blue screen. And really, as an editor, what I decided I took upon myself was I tried to choose action where there was minimal exposure beyond the blue screen. I really didn't want to have to add a lot of roto work, matte creation work, to the process of doing this effect shot, because I knew that it was already a very complicated shot and it was going to take quite a bit of time. So as an editor, one of the considerations I had in mind as the lineup artist was what's going to be the easiest or most pragmatic approach to this effect shot. This is just as important in some cases as actual storytelling. You want to get something that can be done within the budget or within the means of the production. And this, you'd be amazed how many shots can actually be saved in editorial, where you can make something that wasn't going to work as it was planned to work actually come back to life by cleverly changing the approach to the effect shot. Okay, let's go ahead and do the breakdown for the Honda robot spot. Here we start off with some of the pre-visualization at the storyboard stage. You see we've got some conceptual art drawings. These are really important for determining the look of the actual robots. Now, these were going to have to be modeled in both a 3D world and also in a practical world, because there's some close, tight shots on the robots that are actually filmed practically, not just as graphics effects. Here you see some very early 3D modeling tests, and here's a final version of the 3D model, just doing what's called a turntable spin, so that we can see what the model looks like from different sides is lit, and you can see it looks quite gorgeous. So here we have the very first rough cut. Again, this is before any film has been shot. All we have here is a series of 3D animatics, or low quality, very rough 3D animations, intermixed with some very simple 2D elements. Like here you can see we have the car approaching. We just have a storyboard that was drawn and then introduced into the scene. So at this stage we already can see all of the characters' emotions, the timing, the sequencing of shots. It's all very well planned out. And that animatic we just watched, that pre-visualization animatic, I think eloquently expressed the feeling of the final spot. And this is, again, well before any film or any of the real big money has been spent in production. So the agency and the production company are able to establish very early on what they're looking for and get a feel if it's going to work or not as a commercial. Another aspect of the pre-visualization here isn't just for the computer graphic visual effects, but there's several other visual effects here that are being achieved, and you can see that already in the storyboard stage we're thinking ahead to, well, these close-ups, we can build these out of a model and puppeteer the model as opposed to trying to actually build it in CG. This can be more effective, again, because of the details that can be achieved in an actual model, a little bit more realistic perhaps than some of the close-ups that can be done with computer graphics, and it also might be more cost-effective for a certain shot. So it's important to note that the visual effects aren't purely digital visual effects. There's quite a bit of more traditional visual effects here, such as the puppeteering that was done by Jamie Heidemann and his team of puppeteers and artists at M5 here in San Francisco. So add these excellent puppeteered and pyrotechnic effects together with the computer graphics effects, and you've got the whole program. Here we move along into the first of the live action cuts. Again, we're still pre-visualizing here because we don't have the finished spot yet. Here, Alan has taken all of the filmed elements that have come back from the shoot, have been transferred to videotape, and is cutting them together in the sequence that they'll be used in. And you can see that many of the shots are just blank background plates with no animation in them. Several shots of the robot do exist at this point, and that's because those are all practical shots. Those were actually shot on location with a model that was built for the purpose of these close-ups, and that's because close-up computer graphics are often much harder to achieve than just actually practically building a model. Here we move along to a later stage pre-visualization, again, at this point we're actually heavy into the actual commercial in terms of its post-production and visual effects. We have all of the plates with some of the initial effects actually introduced. A lot of the character animation is well along in development. These renders are at lower quality, so the 3D animation isn't in its final pristine state, and that's because rendering at the pristine quality takes a lot longer for the computer. So as the pre-visualization is advancing, as the editorial pieces are coming together, intermediate takes are used instead of the actual finished elements. I want to go back and point out a couple things at this stage of the game. We see that, for example, in this shot, we have an intermediate version of this car without any of the overlay graphics that represent kind of the robot's vision perception, but we do already have some of the motion of the car jiggling up and down, which represents the, again, that acceleration we talked about of the character and of the camera as it approaches the car. Here we can actually go through and see how this car shot evolves. You have the original photograph plate, which is gorgeous, nice and smooth, locked off. Then you have some early pre-visualizations of what that motion might look like as it's kind of sped up and given a little bit of bounce and wobble. Then we have a series of introductions of graphic overlays. There's several different attempts here, trying different quantities and different amount of light, different colors, different speeds of zooming and transparent overlays. This is a series of animation takes that an art director and an animator are working out, trying various options. And I would guess that as many as 20 or 30 different attempts were made before both the client and the artist came to a kind of final look that they wanted for the shot. As you can see, we can pick up these pre-visualized states of these shots at various moments and watch as the shot is evolving towards its final completed form. Here we have an even later version of the previs. I mean, this at this point very near completion. There's just a couple of shots that aren't quite there yet. You know, the overlay graphics aren't fully in. Full renders aren't totally in for both characters, but you can see some of the characters are actually fully rendered, and you can really feel the spot coming together. At this point, it's the home stretch. It's a matter of putting those last sweet touches on, putting in some of the pyrotechnics. We've got all these gorgeous explosions and different light elements that are layered in the foreground and the extreme background in front of the robot. There's some cables that are introduced to add more depth to some of the shots, little lens flares here and there, some little particles exploding onto the floor. It's really just the final touches that make the gorgeous final spot. This is really just an incredible piece of commercial work, if you ask me. Great animation, great visuals, good emotive feelings from all the characters and the animation and the storytelling. Really just a nice spot. Here in the Monte Carlo 2 Lives Chevy spot, we see that the beginning of pre-visualization takes place around a series of animatics, 3D animatics, created very low budget, very rough, not a lot of resolution or detail put into these cars. It's nice to note that they did put the Chevy emblem on the hood of the blue car, the hero car. But short of that, there's not 1 ounce of detail in these cars. However, we are working out all the editorial concerns of the camera movement and of the actor, in this case the car's movement throughout the scene. We have the back and forth movement of the Chevy car as it goes forward and recedes to being in the kind of in-between position amongst the other cars. We have all of the camera's choreographed movement as it moves throughout the scene. All of the evocative action that we receive from the, as cues from that camera movement is already apparent in this very, very early animatic. If you think about it, this is a commercial that would be absolutely impossible to execute with any kind of predictability without all of this pre-visualization work. You can see that this animatic was rendered from various perspectives to aid in the kind of construction of the blueprint plan that was going to be used during the day of the shoot. So we have a bird's eye view from above, we have a profile view, we have a kind of camera point of view that actually shows us what the camera is going to see. All of these views were probably used by the production crew to kind of plot out the actual execution of the shoot on the day that the shooting was done. By the way, it's really interesting to note in this spot, while obviously when you see the commercial, you feel like there's some visual effects going on. But one of them that you might guess incorrectly as a visual effect is the fact that there's these actual stunt drivers out on the track doing these crazy maneuvers with these cars at relatively high speeds. And amongst it all, we have this camera mounted on a crane that's weaving in and out of the action. This must have been an amazing stunt shoot to watch, to see all these very highly trained stunt drivers choreographing this in conjunction with the camera crew and several, probably dozens of production people setting up all the equipment and laying out the track, dressing the track, worrying about lighting, etc. Very intricate shoot and really well played out in the final spot. It looks very nice. Here's an example of where editorial decisions can really save or improve an effect shot that otherwise can't be resolved in the way that it was planned. Here we have the opening shot of the car where there's two separate takes that work for different aspects of the shot. There's two concerns here. One is the car, and that's the primary concern. But another is the background in the sky and the mountains and the clouds and how all that looks balanced together with the car. The car is good in one shot, and the sky and the background and the lighting is good in a different shot. So as an editor, Dennis went through and found those different plates that worked and found a way to cement those two together in a composite that otherwise wouldn't be expected. This shot really could have been executed as one, but because of the way things worked out in production, it became yet another aspect of the effect shot, which is determined during the editorial process. Here we can see the first edit that was performed with the actual filmed plates. And you see that we have three fundamental shots in this spot. We have the opening shot of the car driving in the desert. Then we have the introduction into the environment of the racetrack with all of the dynamic motion that goes on there. And then finally we emerge back in the desert in a nice transition right back to where we started and the car going off into the distance. Now, these three shots were all shot at a overcrank speed of approximately 90 frames per second, so that we'd have extremely stable movement and a lot of extra resolution in the movement, so that if we wanted to speed up or slow down, there would be lots of information in there. And of course, throughout this spot, the camera is accelerating and decelerating as it moves about. So one of the roles in the pre-visualization that Dennis Kutz and the editor had to go through was playing with when to speed up, when to slow down, and how to kind of get a nice rhythm between the speed ups and slows downs. Essentially, those changes in movement of the camera essentially act as cuts. While we're not really cutting between one shot and another, they effectively pace the commercial like they were cuts. So there's a lot of nuance that went into making those decisions of when to speed up, when to slow down, and playing with all those timings as part of the editorial process. Again, this is a pure visual effect. All those changes in speed and velocity are visual effects that were later achieved in a finishing suite in a post house to actually get the different ramps ups and downs. So you can see if we pause it here in the midst of the first transition, the very first pre-visualization of this transition was simply done as a two-dimensional move in the editing room, where this first shot is literally zoomed away from camera. So you can see that this first transition here is a very primitive 2D pullback on one plate to roughly matching up with the position of the other car, and there's a cross dissolve between the two. Now, because it happens relatively quickly, it's kind of hidden, but if we compare this to the actual finished transition, you can see that there's this gorgeous combination of techniques. I would imagine, and I don't know for sure, but I would imagine there was a combination of morphing, of warping to resize the image to match up more accurately so that you'd have this perfect overlap between the two vehicles. It really sells itself as a beautiful transition. It feels as if we've jumped in space and time to some other environment, namely a racetrack, and really there's no discernible artifacting or jarring clue that this is a visual effects shot, of course, other than the fact that this is impossible to do. Notice some of the gorgeous details in here. We have actually some of the desert kind of recessing behind the vehicle, and we can see that some of these rock outcrops kind of remain with us until the very end of the transition. We actually see as if the desert is coming with us to the racetrack. There's a nice blurring of the environment. I mean, this is just a gorgeous shot. Within a shot, that is, because it doesn't stand on its own. It's really a transition shot. But you can see cars fading in, grass dissolving away, the edges of the car lining up nicely. Then we come into this kind of stylized environment here in the final at the racetrack environment, where we have a nice kind of soft blur around the different cars, which kind of de-emphasizes the racing cars and emphasizes our hero car. All these very gorgeous details transpire in the blink of an eye in the final spot. Also to note, there's several several visual effects within this shot going on. There's reflections that are being added to the car. There's shadows that are being removed from the car. You can note in this part of the shot here that there's actually a crane that's reflecting because the camera is on a crane. We actually see a reflection of that crane in the nice polished black surface of the car. All these details had to be resolved. And again, there'll be much more details about how these other parts of visual effects work were done in other programs in the series. But keeping to the pre-visualization aspects, you can see that how critical all the early decisions were about timing, pacing, and camera movement, and how those rippled through not only through the shoot and the first offline edit, but also into the final spot, which is kind of a gorgeous one-shot effect that's 30 seconds long that tells the story of this car as it moves from these different environments.
There are two sides to every Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo. The side you show the world is up to you.
The other thing to bear in mind is that not only do we need to pre-visualize our visual effects, but there's also the audio component to our visual effects. We basically worked MOS without any real audio throughout most of the pre-production and production for Keep Clear. It wasn't until pretty close to the end of the production schedule where we actually started to get rough ideas of some of the sound sweetening, the sound of the brakes, the sound of the UFOs, the marching band audio. All of these kind of extra sounds were brought in towards the end. And that's really because there was a very clear blueprint of what the sound design was going to be like. And director Corey Rosen was working offline with the sound designer to actually, talk through some of the needs of the show from a sound point of view. Here in the duck shot, you can see that as the ducks are being added, we are improving the quality of the different the mats that we're using to composite them into the scene. We're going in and adding extra shadows so that the ducks look like they're in the environment. We're actually going in and putting in a reflection pass into the bumper so that the ducks actually feel like they're reflecting off the bumper, which kind of subtly sells that these ducks somehow belong in the scene. There's several color correction passes to get the ducks to look like they're the right lighting. All these iterative processes begin with a simple storyboard and slowly progress towards the final visual effect as we move through the editorial and pre-visualization stages. So here we can break down the various pre-visualization stages for some of the other shots and see how they evolve towards their final composites. Here we have some of the early UFO animation that was done at very low resolutions, very rough, just getting a sense for texture and movement and lighting. As these were given to me, the editor, I started to incorporate these in with some of the actual foreground elements of the abductees, initially with very rough mats, very rough visual effect, but again, focusing on the timing, playing with the rate at which these different characters are being sucked up, the composition of how many are on the right, how many are on the left, when they come into frame, how prominently our attention wants to be focused on some of our heroes here, namely the mime, the mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, who's here in the foreground, and of course one of the ninjas, which is one of the stars. You can see some of the other characters, such as the band members, which are more supporting cast members. They're kind of sporadically kind of window dressed around the scene because none of them are very recognizable as characters. Whereas in the foreground, we really want to see our heroes, the couple of characters that we've really seen full screen in front of the camera and moving across the car. We will recognize them in the effect shot. So you can see that we've played with the composition and with the timing and the direction of movement. All of these things I've talked about as being important as editorial decisions and as pre-visualization decisions. It's all transpiring in this shot, and you can see that from the very beginning. Here again is the first pre-visualization. You can see it's very rough, very schematic-like, very little detail. And then here you can see the final shot with a lot of rich added variables in terms of little light details, little changes in speed and direction. All these things evolved over a series of pre-visualizations. But if you go back to the very first pre-visualized storyboard, you can already see some of the elements in terms of their composition and their timing already in place that really weren't finished until 5 months later when we actually finalized the shot. It was the last shot finalized in the show. It was one of the more complex shots. So here we can go ahead and jump ahead to after the shoot. You can see that there's a new shot in the actual program. There's actually a couple, which are some establishing shots of the car driving into the scene. Then we have our establishing shot of the perception of the car and of our lead character. Here the editing is still a little bit choppy. It's before we've actually come into the final timings. And in fact, looking back on it now, it's pretty disappointing to look at. There's a couple of shots that we actually cut all together, such as the gear shift pulling the car into park. We decided that was unnecessary. But here you can see we're starting to play out the pacing, the energy level, and of course the effect shots. So coming up right here, we'll see the first of the effect shots, and you can see we've slammed in a very rough sense, some of the ducks in front of the car just to get a sense of what things were looking like. Now, those timings of the ducks are nothing like what we ended up with in later stages. Likewise, here you can see the first attempt at the third big visual effects shot, where we have the composite of the mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, and his bodyguards walking against the marching band in the background. So that, again, was just a rough timing lineup. There's some composition issues there where we had repositioned the foreground elements against the blue screen a little bit farther south so that we could see them better. Let's actually follow some of these major effect shots through their progress from multiple pre-visualizations and the editorial process to the actual first attempts at rendering them once the actual film had been scanned and more high-resolution images were being attempted. I'll be covering the full details of how the Keep Clear post-production process took place in a later program in the series. So here you can see as the ducks are evolving, we have a more concise action on the ducks. We actually finalized the ducks that we were going to use, the pieces of duck that we were going to use. We actually decided to use 2 different takes of ducks, one with our hero duck who comes out first, and then a second pass of ducks that come out to follow him. This is the original Keep Clear animatic that we put together using a series of storyboards that were created by Scott Liebrick, the art director on the show. These storyboards convey a lot of the feeling and emotion and some of the action. You can see he uses arrows or a series of frames that indicate camera framing and how that camera framing might change over time, such as on this shot where we pull back. There's a frame indicating what the frame is, but you see what the action is outside of the frame, which kind of is basically a talking piece for the director and the production staff to think about how things might be framed, if there might be some camera movement, etc. In the animatic, I introduced a series of soft, basically DVE moves over the images to create a little bit of a sense of movement, because watching a bunch of still black and white frames over 5 or 6 seconds at a time can get kind of monotonous. So by just introducing a little bit of motion, a little bit of change in scale, I was trying to insinuate some of the dynamic nature of some of these shots, where people would be walking across screen or the camera would be moving a little bit, as in this shot with the UFO where we pan up a little bit. Here where there's a sense of being sucked up into the ship, so I kind of pushed in a little just to infer that the people would be moving towards the ship. There actually isn't a move in that shot. It's a locked off shot, and we knew that all along, but just for the animatic we wanted to create more motion. Here at the end you can see I actually animated the mime falling back into frame. By doing a combination of moves on the shot. We have the car receding, which I animated, and then this mime falling into frame with his unicycle. Well, it turned out we couldn't find a mime who knew how to ride a unicycle, so in the end we went with a simpler setup. And some of those shots were actually changed either a little bit later on after this animatic was cut, or actually after the cut we changed some of the order of some of the shots around. But basically, if you look at this animatic in the final film, there's actually a remarkable similarity between what was envisioned by the director 5 months before the film was actually finished. The running time durations are very similar. The structure of the program are very similar. And as we've said, as a pre-visualization task, this really helped to focus everyone's attention on, from the art director to myself, the editor, to the people that were going to be involved on the set in terms of wrangling the animals, the ducks, or getting the different crew members, the different cast members out onto location. All of that was basically planned using these storyboards and this animatic as a talking piece. Certain props had to be created, such as the Keep Clear sign itself. There was also a couple of shots where the camera position was kind of challenging, namely the one where we're looking from within the glove box out into the car. Well, obviously we couldn't cram the 35mm camera gear inside of a glove box, so a prop was built of a glove box that we could shoot through, etc. There's several things that were planned here in the pre-visualization stage, pre-production, before going out with the camera. Hope you enjoyed the program, and good luck on your next edit. I hope that these concepts will come in handy in making your next effect shot a real masterpiece. For a lot more details on the subject of For a lot more specific details about post-production, you can refer to the program on the subject that's hosted. These are the simple things in life. Hey, for more information, for the nitty-gritty on all the details of post-production, you can refer to my program on the subject in another part of the series. No, not quite. Close, getting there. For all the gross details about, no, it's not gross, it's beautiful. For all the specific details of post-production, you can refer to the program specifically designated as the post-production. What am I saying? This is so hard. Okay, this is gonna be it. This is the one right here, baby. This is for you. No. Dangling sentence. For a complete overview of the post-production process, you can refer to my tape. No, no. Mama. Good luck on your next edit.
Listen, there you go. Woo.
For all the details on post-production, you can refer to my program on the subject. Okay, well, we got it.
No, we did not.
I thought you said it was fine.
Give it to me again.
This is the one. Here, forget about the others. This is it. For the complete overview of the post-production process from A to Z, you can refer to the program on the subject in the series. This bag, you know what? Who cares? They'll find it sooner enough. Okay, hold on. Yeah, I got it. This is it. This is it. This is it. This is it. Right here, right now. We won't go into all the nitty-gritty of post-production here. Let's focus just on the previs. We won't go on. I'm not going to go into any more nitty-gritty of post-production right now, but there's a full program on the.
On the subject. Also in the series. That I hosted.
When you're ready, you can turn to the post-production tape.
Program. Go on.
I just can't do it. Turn it off, Peter.